Welcome to episode 38 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
This is the kind of episode that makes you want to cry. It's not funny. Since this show started, we've been talking about ransomware off and on. Someone tries to get you to do something that downloads a thing that locks up your computer. But for X amount of cryptocurrency, they will theoretically unlock your computer. Then you can figure out how to keep that from happening again. It's bad when that happens to you or someone you know. Now, multiply that by the planet. The world saw one of the largest ransomware attacks conducted so far just a couple of weeks ago. The story has captured public attention for longer than most digital security stories do, and for good reason. Not only did this attack strike more than 100 countries and affect critical institutions worldwide, but it also showed the work of some digital heroes. People in the security community who kept the attack from being much, much worse than it was. From its shadowy origins to its very visible effects, the ransomware known as WannaCrypt, or WannaCry, and other names as well, is our topic for today's edition of The Checklist. Breaking that topic down, we'll be hitting how WannaCry went public, how it got so big, how big an impact it did have, how it was stopped the first time, and finally, what is the state of WannaCry currently and in the days to come. So let's start with just that very first one. How did this end up everywhere?
Well, it started with a leak of secret NSA documents. We've briefly touched on the concept of state-sponsored malware in a couple of previous episodes. One example that's always easy to return to is the Stuxnet worm, which attacked and damaged Iranian industrial facilities. Russia-linked malware efforts have also received some widespread attention, particularly in the last couple of years. For a nation-state to deploy malware, it must engage in security research of its own. Now, one might expect that to mean uncovering vulnerabilities to exploit as well. But why do we bring up this subject? Well, at the root of the entire WannaCrypt, WannaCry fiasco is an exploit that was originally developed or purchased on the gray market by the United States National Security Agency, or NSA. This story began almost a year ago and sparked a chain of events that finally led to the unleashing of this ransomware attack. So let's build a quick timeline here, beginning with last summer. A group calling itself the Shadow Brokers appeared in early August, claiming to have in its possession a large cache of cyber weapons and tools that are useful for exploiting vulnerabilities. Their source, they said, was a hack they conducted on another collective known as the Equation Group, which has links back to the Stuxnet worm. Now, several researchers, including Kaspersky Labs, have speculated that the Equation Group is, in fact, the National Security Agency. This is due to the high level of sophistication seen throughout the group's activities. Recent events seem to corroborate this and point to this being more likely true than not. To demonstrate that there was some truth behind these claims, the shadow brokers began to release a slow stream of information on the web. Their goal, of course, was to extract payment in exchange for these tools. Unfortunately for them, potential buyers were skeptical, so they didn't really find any takers. They posted information and data that seemed to be real. At the very least, some of the file names and other materials matched up with what we know from the Edward Snowden leaks. Several shadow broker leaks contained screenshots of folders and files that seemed to indicate Equation Group-linked tools. The group even released a set of exploits that affected a large number of Cisco routers, plus an exploit that functions only on certain Unix systems. Despite these leaks, no significant damage or significant attacks occurred. Now, during this time, the shadow brokers continued to try and sell the entire data set. Their first demand was an outrageous 1 million bitcoins, a sum that no one could ever pay. Later on, they revised the price down to 10,000 bitcoins, and they even attempted to kind of run a little auction. And none of that panned out for them. However, despite subsequent postings showing off more data to prove their claims of an enormous cache of tools, no one paid. They basically kind of had to give up. Where did they get the information in the first place? Were they able to penetrate the NSA and steal the files? That seems unlikely. But in October of 2016, news broke that an NSA contractor was suspected of a massive data theft. In total, the man, Harold Martin, was alleged to have hoarded nearly 50 terabytes of data. Not gigabytes, terabytes. It's an enormous amount of data. Much of that included highly sensitive and powerful hacking tools and NSA-developed exploits. Naturally, there's some speculation that the shadow brokers hacked or stole the data from Martin. While some think Martin is behind the leaks, there is no concrete evidence to that effect. He was actually in custody while the shadow brokers continued releasing information on Twitter. So for now, the identity of the person or persons behind this group remain a mystery. Now, fast forward to April 14th. There was a leak dubbed Lost in Translation. Shadow brokers tweeted a link which led to another site which hosted an encrypted download of some files, and they supplied the password as well. And immediately, security researchers realized that shadow brokers had finally released something with the true potential to cause some real damage. Inside this leak were a number of tools and exploits that exposed severe vulnerabilities in Windows systems. The portion of this leak that led to WannaCrypt is called the Eternal Blue exploit. Whoever the authors of WannaCrypt are, they quickly jumped on the opportunities presented by this leak. And we'll discuss a bit more about what Eternal Blue actually does in a moment here. But for now, what's important to know is that it is an undetectable way for someone to gain access to almost any Windows machine through a file sharing protocol. The WannaCrypt authors created malware that leveraged this exploit to open a backdoor to a machine, allowing them to dump the payload that encrypts your files at a pretty fast rate. An interesting point to note, the vulnerability exploited by Eternal Blue was actually patched in current versions of Windows, like Windows 7, Windows 10, back in March. How could Microsoft know to patch this very obscure and secretive exploit before it was revealed to the world? Well, the Washington Post reports that the NSA tipped off the Redmond giant in advance of the leak, recognizing the potential damage that this exploit could cause. Unfortunately, Microsoft decided not to release a patch at that time for systems that would likely be most vulnerable. All the untold number of legacy systems that were still running Windows XP or Windows Vista, because they had reached the end of their service life, they were no longer supported by Microsoft.
That's crazy, though. Well, sorry. I know Windows XP was running for 15 years before Microsoft finally dropped support for it?
Something like that.
It was a very, very long time. I know that. So I'm guessing I know the answer to the next question. How did this go from just sort of being released to being all over the place? It's because of all of the old systems that are no longer being patched?
Yeah. I mean, even think about your friends or your family that have old computer systems that use it for work with software that is no longer supported on new systems, or they just don't have the financial means to update it, or it just simply still works for them. I mean, so many of these computers they're still out there. So now with Eternal Blue out in the wild, it was only a matter of time before someone sought to exploit it in some way. In fact, it turns out that other hackers were using these same exploits weeks before WannaCrypt appeared on the scene. The difference was that instead of holding data for ransom, the hackers silently installed mining software for a cryptocurrency similar in style to Bitcoin. Infected machines joined a global botnet aimed at generating more of this currency called Monero. Well, on Friday, May 12th, the ramifications of the shadow brokers leaks, it became a harsh reality. Around 4 a.m. Eastern Time, the first WannaCrypt infections began to enter the wild. Through the use of both Eternal Blue exploit as well as another exploit, Double Pulsar. The malware had the ability to quickly and rapidly infect machines. It would then begin making the jump to more PCs. So let's try breaking down exactly how it accomplished what it did. We can start by asking what exactly is Eternal Blue and how does it work? And knowing this, it could help us understand why WannaCrypt is so viral and difficult to stop. Eternal Blue exploits a vulnerability in a portion of Windows networking code called SMB, or Server Message Block. It's a protocol for allowing access to file folders across a network. This could include the ability to write data as well as read it. There are two versions of SMB. SMB version 1, it's old and mostly obsolete, but still in use in some forms. SMB version 2 is the more modern version. Eternal Blue is a method for creating a very special packet of data to pass through the SMB protocol. Think of it as figuring out a password to a very exclusive club. Once you say it to the doorman, you're in, except this password makes everyone think you own the place. WannaCrypt uses the Eternal Blue exploit to gain a foothold on the user's machine, at which point it deploys the NSA-developed Double Pulsar backdoor. Now, Double Pulsar runs with kernel-level permissions, meaning the hacker can control the entire machine remotely as if he were the user himself. At this point in the infection, the actual WannaCrypt ransomware installs itself, and then it begins to encrypt all the files. It seems like some initial versions were distributed via an infected word processing file, but after that, the malware's worm capability took over. WannaCry includes a scanning module that looks for open ports on machines connected to the internet that it can access. This aggressive scanning enables the malware to find and infect unpatched computers, sometimes in as little as 3 minutes. One machine, which was set up as a honeypot, it recorded 6 infections over an hour and a half. Worse still, the worm scans the local network as well, blasting out data traffic in every direction as possible. As soon as it finds another machine on the network, it sends a copy over and infects that machine too. It was this function that allowed WannaCry to run rampant and virtually unchecked through corporate and medical networks built on older Windows machines.
So what's interesting about this, a lot of times the stuff that we talk about as far as the ransomware or other dangers that people face, they kind of have to be active. They have to do something. They have to click on a link. They have to download a thing. They have to do something. It sounds like from what you're saying, what you had to be doing to get this was simply be using an unpatched machine. Do I have that correct?
Exactly. That's the way that computer worms work. They normally don't require any user intervention beyond maybe the very first infection or a couple infections. Once they start running over a network, they will just automatically infect any vulnerable machine, which is why they can spread so quickly and so fast. It doesn't require the user to be falling for a phishing scam or running a Trojan horse. They just have to have their computer turned on and connected to a network and not be patched for whatever vulnerability.
And because this hit so many different businesses, I mean, I know I used to leave work with my computer. Well, I don't think I left. Well, probably I did, actually. People can be sort of lazy about how they treat their work computer. They'll just, leave for the day or leave for the weekend and leave their computer on. It might be locked, but it would still be open for all intents and purposes to some kind of malware like this.
If you leave for lunch and you've got, say you even have a screensaver password, well, your screen's locked, your keyboard's locked, but your computer's still running, still on the network. Stuff can still happen. And hundreds of thousands of machines in many countries were affected. As you might expect, any malware with the capability to grant itself unfettered access to a vulnerable machine is going to spread like wildfire. With the malware in the wild, some of the first initial infections actually occurred in Spain. And from there, it moved on to infect scores of machines in Russia. In fact, that's actually where the lion's share of infections took place over the duration of the attack. But other countries like the UK suffered more severe effects. Overall, this event provides a case study in what could happen when malware rises to the level of a major threat very quickly. Obviously, what it does is simple enough, but the consequences of that simple action were far-reaching and quite damaging. So let's spend a minute talking about what the actual ramifications of this were outside of individual user cases. Now, if you watched the headlines in the past few weeks, you probably saw the story as it was reported when it broke initially, that the UK's National Health Service was being struck by a ransomware attack. As it happens, the NHS, in part due to a lack of adequate technology funding, mostly ran old and unpatched versions of Windows XP. As a result, many doctors and nurses soon found themselves staring at the ransom demand of roughly $300 in bitcoins before their lunch break. Due to the nature of the worm, it quickly leapt from computer to computer in hospitals and doctors' offices around the UK. In all, at least 16 separate NHS organizations suffered disruption due to the attack. Now, thankfully, no one was hurt as a result of this incident. There were no sudden failures of life support machines or anything to that effect. Instead, patient files became inaccessible and wait times skyrocketed as teams tried to figure out what to do. Elsewhere in the world, WannaCrypt was spreading like wildfire, infecting tens of thousands of machines, ultimately spanning the globe, with problems appearing in more than 100 countries. In the United States, FedEx confirmed to the media that some of its Windows systems had been compromised. Major telecom providers in Russia and Portugal saw infections. In Germany, riders waiting for their trains were treated to giant display boards showing off the ransom message instead of the timetables. A similar outcome occurred in China, where one of the nation's largest banks, the Bank of China, saw its ATMs infected. Social media quickly filled up with images of ATMs and other electronic kiosks, obviously infected, displaying that ransomware message. In the midst of all of this, Microsoft quickly released additional patches covering products all the way back to Windows XP. Many people viewed this as an extraordinary move that signaled the gravity of the situation with this vulnerability and the subsequent attack. Now, users and businesses would have a way to protect their older software from WannaCrypt. While it wouldn't do anything to help those already infected, it was a good step towards slowing down the malware's advance. Even systems which were not infected went offline for the duration of the initial weekend that this attack occurred, because many companies judged the risk to be too great. They didn't know exactly what was going on yet. It was just smarter to shut everything down. Also, applying updates immediately is not always an option, especially for larger companies, because of the perceived risk of how the updates might affect their other systems, their other programs. Normally, in larger companies, you actually have to do quite a bit of testing before you apply a patch across your entire system, because if it breaks something critical to your sales team or something like that, it's obviously something you don't want to dive into for no good reason. So therefore, the prudent choice for a lot of those companies was just to turn everything off and wait out the attack. And as it turned out, the worst of it would actually be over sooner rather than later. Yeah, this was kind of a weird weekend. I mean, for people who don't remember, because boy, there's a whole lot of all kinds of news at this point, and this was a couple of weeks ago as we talk about it. I want to say in the States, we heard about it on Friday. We heard that it basically kind of slowed down, but then there was a concern that it was going to kick back in again on Monday when people went back to work and turned back on their computers. So we got to spend, a bit of a weekend wondering what Monday was going to bring in terms of malware, which was actually kind of weird. You don't usually have that. Usually, I mean, not since Y2K, I think, if we all sat around wondering what was going to happen when everybody turned their computers on again. Talk to me though about that initial stop that kind of slowed WannaCrypt.
So that was the kill switch, and that's what everybody started talking about. Throughout the chaos on the initial day of the attack, security researchers and anti-malware authors alike worked around the clock trying to stem the tides of the new infections. For those who were already infected, the question of the day was, how recent are your backups? With businesses shutting down machines throughout the week to prevent the possibility of WannaCrypt spreading throughout their networks, many returned to older pen and paper systems. Yet the attack could have been much worse than the events we've already described. By the early afternoon, new infections had slowed down immensely. But why? Well, it turns out that a security researcher digging through the programming of WannaCrypt uncovered a hidden kill switch that would end up stopping the malware's spread dead in its tracks. So how exactly does that work? And why would malware have such an off switch built into it in the first place? Well, the switch was uncovered by a researcher known as MalwareTech, and it's more straightforward than you might expect. While analyzing a sample of WannaCrypt provided by another researcher, MalwareTech realized that during its operation, the malware made requests to a web domain. The URL for this site was long. It was a nonsense string of alphanumeric characters, and it was unregistered. So anybody could go out there and register it. Why would the malware actually need to query an unregistered domain name, though? That's the question MalwareTech asked himself. So he did the next logical thing. He registered the domain himself, then pointed it to a sinkhole server. What are sinkhole servers? Well, it's a method researchers use to capture and analyze malicious web traffic while preventing it from going elsewhere. While MalwareTech and others continued to look through this information, they realized they were now having problems replicating some of the ransomware behaviors. It didn't take them long to realize that they had flipped the kill switch. In WannaCrypt's code was a command to quit running if and only if the domain in question responded to its query. But why? MalwareTech and others speculate that this might have been an anti-analysis tool. Many anti-malware teams, they use virtual environments to check out the malware in a way that won't infect their actual machines. To do that often requires trying to trick the malware into thinking it's running on a real machine and not a virtual computer. One important component to this involves simulating web connections, which would mean a fake response from a domain that shouldn't be registered at all. Thus, the malware would terminate itself before a researcher had the opportunity to actually pull it apart.
Okay, wait, I'm sorry, that's hysterical. So, if I'm understanding what you're saying, they put a dummy URL in there for it to query, figuring nobody's ever going to register this URL. So this guy registered the URL, and the malware thought that it was in a virtual machine, so it stopped, but it was actually in a real machine, so it stopped.
Yes, actually, just a quick note on that. Virtual machines, just because they want to work, even if a web, like a URL, a domain name doesn't actually go to anything, a lot of times a virtual machine will just act like it does, just to help everything run smoothly. In this case, if it was on a real machine and that domain hadn't been registered and the malware tried to connect to it, it would have seen, this domain doesn't exist, this site doesn't exist type response. But on a virtual machine, it would have been like, oh yeah, the site exists, just because of the nature of the way virtual machines work with networking stuff. But yeah, you're exactly right there. It thought it was on a real machine, real machine, and that, it thought it was on a virtual machine then. So yes, it kind of reversed the behavior of the malware.
Well, actually, it was sort of the malware's worst fears coming true, that it was actually querying a real machine at that point, but that killed it. But that would have been something that would have killed it if it thought it was on a virtual machine. That's kind of crazy. That's almost Matrix level, like what's real and what's not for malware. But anyway, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. So that's some people think that it might have been an anti-analysis tool. What else might it have been?
Some also think it may have been a method for stopping the spread of the software if it went out of control. For now, there's no clear way to know. But what is certain is that it dramatically slowed the pace of new infections throughout the weekend of the attack. The original version of WannaCrypt, at least, had finally been tamed after hours of chaos and distress. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before new variants of the threat began to appear. Some versions change the domain name in the code, while others lack the kill switch altogether, and thus could spread unchecked and unpatched systems. So far, though, that hasn't happened en masse like the original version. Different Bitcoin wallets would seem to indicate these new versions aren't produced by the original authors. Instead, it's probably opportunists looking to cash in on the backs of the successful attack. Many worried that these new versions would cause problems of their own when systems came back online Monday morning. However, the application of updates and the use of the kill switch seem to prevent any major outbreaks. Now, while the attack is still ongoing in a low-level form, the peak intensity has passed. We think it's important to note, though, that many machines still suffer from vulnerabilities to Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar. The chances that we'll see additional malware using these attack vectors on Windows machines is quite high.
All right, so that covers basically a very busy weekend for a lot of people, and a very worrisome weekend for a lot of people. The initial, I guess, attack for WannaCry is over, but what's the future look like?
So between the MalwareTech kill switch and the Microsoft patch being applied to many of those vulnerable systems, it seems that the main brunt of this attack is mostly over for now. Even though there are new versions out there that lack the original kill switch, it's unlikely that we'll see another similarly widespread attack of this nature using the same exploits. Of course, that's true with one caveat. Enterprise machines must have the patch installed. Windows machines that don't install the patch will still remain vulnerable. And, there are probably other exploits out there, so it's not like this type of threat itself is going away anytime soon. Now, as much global disruption as this malware caused, it generated a comparatively small return for its creators. By the end of the initial weekend, only about $25,000 had been generated in ransom. And as of today's podcast, the Bitcoin wallets attached to WannaCrypt still show less than $100,000 in total ransom funds. One might imagine the hackers expected something a bit more substantial. Also important to note, with so much visibility for the attack, those Bitcoin wallets will now be watched very closely for any signs of activity. Overall, the attack could have been much worse. For example, what if it had been targeted rather than a shotgun approach? Deployment of malware like this on systems for infrastructure even more critical than hospitals could have resulted in more than inconvenience. It will be interesting to see in the coming months whether similar attacks leveraging these exploits will arise, or if the shadow brokers will expose new threats. The good news, obviously, is that Mac users were spared from this attack. Eternal Blue and other NSA-linked exploits almost exclusively focus on dominating Windows systems. If you run Boot Camp on your Mac and run an older version of Windows, however, you could be affected. This is neither the time to be smug nor relaxed. In fact, we should all take this for the eye-opening lesson it is. Major malware attacks can and will happen, and with increasing frequency, it seems. In the face of that, we need to choose not to respond with fear or anxiety, but instead vigilance and a determination to develop good security. It's the better choice. Just because Mac users were safe from the WannaCrypt attack in general doesn't mean we won't face other threats in the future. Regular listeners might remember that last year we saw the emergence of the KeyRanger ransomware that infected Macs through the transmission BitTorrent client. While the impact was limited, it proved that there are malware authors out there trying to find ways to attack Mac users. That's why making a proactive effort to defend yourself is so important. It also demonstrates the importance of staying up to date on your security patches. Think about it. If everyone took the time and energy necessary to keep crucial software up to date, malware authors would have a much tougher time attacking our data. While WannaCrypt preyed on the tendency to rely on old operating systems, there was a patch available for newer systems before it even was released. If everyone took the time and effort to stay on top of system updates, perhaps a large number of Windows users would never have seen the WannaCrypt screen at all. Though the introduction of NSA hacking tools into the equation certainly complicated matters, out-of-date systems remained a root cause of the attack. Apple's commitment to hardening their software remains apparent, at least. Coincidentally, in fact, Apple dropped a round of patches for many of its products on the exact same day that WannaCrypt was unleashed on the world. These included updates for everything from macOS and iOS all the way to the more niche minor products like watchOS and Apple TV. Now, if you haven't grabbed these updates yet, we suggest you do so soon. In total, Apple corrected almost 70 flaws in all, each of them a unique and possibly potent vulnerability on its own. These would have allowed an attacker to gain privilege on your system and begin executing code arbitrarily. In other words, they could have also been leveraged in the same way as WannaCrypt to deploy all manner of nasty software, including ransomware. This is a topic we come back to a lot, both here and elsewhere. Update your devices. When your iPhone pops up the update window, do you find that you're always pressing the remind me later? It's a habit that's really easy to get into. Updates take time, and when do we have time to be away from our devices on a busy day? So take a step back and weigh the reality of the situation. It might take time, but the result is a secure device protected from the latest threats. Safeguarding your data is worth the 10 or 15 minutes it might take to install that update. Since Apple is also often quick to issue patches as soon as it becomes aware of a threat or even just a potential threat, it can help prevent being swept up in a sudden wave of malware, like the way WannaCrypt wreaked havoc across the globe.
Now, I can't believe I'm going to be the one to say this, but a good backup also would have been helpful for a lot of this, correct? No, I mean, seriously, because
yes.
I mean, part of the problem is this is what we've always talked about ransomware. And when I say we, I mean you. Somebody, hits your computer and says, hey, pay me $300 to get your data. If you've not been running good backups, you have to find some other way to get in there or pay the $300, which is never a good suggestion because they may not even unlock your data anyway. Whereas if you had a relatively recent backup, I mean, you can just sort of bag that whole thing and get back into your information, correct?
Yes, and in this case, actually, the research pointed to the fact that the malware authors were manually responding to unlock requests. Normally with ransomware, it's an automated system. You pay the ransom and automatically get the code back to unlock your files. In this case, they were emailing people back.
Wow.
One by one. So think about that like from a support perspective.
So they might have made more than 25,000. They just haven't gotten to everybody yet.
Exactly. They've got a bit of a backlog.
Oh, the best one was the story about the guy who was just financially not able to pay it, and they ended up just unlocking it for him.
For free.
That's some good tech support right there.
That's so world girding conspiracy with a heart. It sounds like. Yeah. So we covered a lot of information on this show. We cover a lot of information on every show, including if you want to know more about ransomware, we've done a show about that. If you want to know more about keeping good backups, we've done a show about that. Gosh, well, we're up to almost 40 shows at this point, so lots of shows behind us and lots of shows yet to come. If you miss anything or if you want to revisit some of those old shows, securemac.com/checklist is the website to check out. securemac.com/checklist. If you have problems, questions, or concerns, maybe a topic you would like to hear us hit, we do have an email address. It is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, do remember this. You are listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.